and so many people from so many different disciplines, actually, and different departments. So thank you very much for everyone who came. Also to those who didn't reply, but there is still food left. So if you've been holding back because you didn't reply, feel free to grab a sandwich. Before I introduce Johannes, Emily, who's one of the co-conveners of the AMEN network, is going to say a few things about another event that we've planned for March, and then we'll come to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily Henderson from the Centre for Education Studies, one of the co-conveners of the Academic Mobilities and Immobilities Network. Kuula Tanaku is also there from PACE, and Heike Bele is our other convener who can be here today, Stephanie being the other one. And thanks for co-hosting this with the PAD network. So this is going to act a bit as a sort of prelude to an event that we're holding on International Women's Day on gender and academic mobility, which we're holding in collaboration with the Society for Research into Higher Education. And it's a sort of whole day, or more or less a whole day event with some quite exciting speakers coming from various other countries and universities. So there are still places available, but you do need to sign up for it. If you have any sort of doubts about how to sign up, you can email us very simply at amin@warwick.ac.uk, AMIN, or you can get in touch with one of us if you know us as conveners. But we do encourage you to come along if you're interested in what Johannes has to say. You'll be interested in that event as well. And I should also flag up that we have a blog for AMIN, and if any of you firstly would like to write a post about Johannes's talk today, we just look for quite short posts, 300 to 500 words, also if you're actually working on an area that is related to academic mobility, we welcome any posts about kind of ongoing research publications, any presentations you might be doing. So do bear that in mind, and again you can email Amin or you can email me. I run the blog e.henderson@warwick.ac.uk. The only other thing I would say is that I'm going to take a couple of photos during today's talk that we would like to put on our website. Perhaps if you would rather not be in one of the photos, come and have a word with me at the end, and I can check that you're not in any of the photos that I include. Okay, thank you.
Right, very good. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our very own Johannes today to give a talk in this year, as Emily said, jointly hosted event between the Academic Mobilities and Immobilities Network and the PAD Research Group. Sue unfortunately can't be here today because she's still a bit poorly, but hopefully we'll have her back soon. So as I was preparing, I'm only going to say very, very few things about Johannes because we all know him so well, but as I was preparing for this, I thought, you're such an ideal person to give this talk because you're really bringing together this, basically what AMIN is all about, this idea of academic mobilities with what PAD is all about, namely discourse analysis. So, I'm really glad you're here to give this talk. So Johannes is a professor at Cal since 2012, and before that, I learned from your website, you've worked in Germany, France, Russia, the US, so where next? Sticking with the topic of today, but we'll see. You've got your PhD from Paris and Magdeburg, and an MA in German, from Germany. And today's talk is, the title of today's talk is Gender and Mobility in Academic Careers, Preliminary Results from the DISCONEX project, which of course a lot of us know about, so thank you very much.
Thanks so much for this invitation, and it's so lovely to see this event here. Really, thanks to Amin, this is a very nice idea, and I'm very much looking forward to not only the intellectual exchange, but also to the informal get-together that we can have here. This is a good occasion to talk about the DISCONEX project, the work that we've been doing here in the project for the last 4 years, and I want to emphasize that here we talk about preliminary results. We've done quite some collecting of data. We can show few things, but there are many more things to come in the future, which we can't really talk about yet. Also, there's some theoretical ideas which I want to try out here. So, in a word, it's preliminary. It's the usual chaos, and it's always been like that. And I think I gave up to think it's ever changed. So please forgive me for some of the rock and roll kind of ideas that haven't been finished yet. So basically what I want to do is to give you some theoretical insights into what we do, some empirical stuff, with a special focus on the question of gender and mobility. And DISCONEX is a project which investigates academic researchers in a number of countries, especially in the 3 big European countries, the UK, France and Germany. We also have a few researchers from the US. It's way too big to study it exhaustively. We do exhaustive analysis of all full professors of linguistics, sociology, and 1 or 2 small interdisciplinary fields like semiotics. And so basically this is a project which uses various methods on different levels. We have a CV database with about 3,000 full professors, and we do semi-structured interviews with 200 academics from these countries and disciplines. These are from all kinds of status ranks. And then we do a number of individual projects, qualitative case studies, and maybe the team members, because it's really a team, we really work together, could just talk about it very briefly. Maybe first team member, hear me?
Yes.
Maybe, I mean, you briefly say what you do in the project.
We did together. Yeah, hello, I'm Kyung-mi Kim from Cal. I'm research assistant of DISCONEX project, and I'm entering data on Webby, which is a website where we put profile of professors, and I browse website of institutional websites, so university websites, and then I collect data from there, like their careers and education, their research interests and projects and so on. Yes.
Yeah, Webby is the name, our name for the CV database. It started with Debbie because the abbreviation was DB database, Debbie, and then it went online, so Debbie became Webby. That's background. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Johannes Beetz. I'm a PhD student in the DISCONEX project, and I also helped collecting data for this database. But my main project is qualitative, and I do interviews with sociologists and sociologists in Germany and the UK, and I analyze the introductory chapters of their first books. I'm interested in the ways that they position themselves in their discipline and in the social world through their writing and talking.
Ronnie?
Yeah, I'm Ronnie Scholz. I'm the project manager. I try to coordinate the workflow in the team and make sure that the resources are always available.
And you also work on?
Yeah, sometimes I do some research. Yeah, but it doesn't.
On corpuses, for example.
Yeah.
I think Cecilia is next, yeah.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Ha from Cal as well. I'm a PhD student in DISCONEX. I do interviews with researchers in applied linguistics and linguistics in UK, and I'm mainly interested in how they position themselves as researchers and their research in relation to the larger disciplinary fields.
Yeah. Okay, so the PhD projects are a bit more focused on particular cases. Martha works on impact discourse, for example, in the UK. what I will do here is to give some more aggregate data across countries so that we can start to think about the comparative challenges of the project. And what do we study here? In DISCONEX we deal with academic researchers and their practices. We call that academic discourse in a very specific sense. That is, in a both sociological and linguistic sense, we are interested in the way that academic researchers negotiate their social positions in the world of research. We're much interested in biographies, careers, the attribution of success, the question of hierarchies, and our focus is on the role of language, the way that the use of language, scientific communication, helps construct and reproduce and also undermine certain inequalities in higher education. So the DISCONEX question is how academics participate in evaluation of academics. The idea being that in their everyday practices they not only are abstract, ideal human kind of knowledge producers, but they also do very concrete social things, like making sure that certain kind of distinctions between people, they define social roles, they coordinate each other. So academics do a lot of social things that can lead to social inequality and hierarchy among researchers and among academics. And they do it through the discursive practices they're engaged in. By using text and talk, for example, they talk about themselves, but also about others. And as a result of these positioning practices, certain social inequalities can be constructed and can become real for researchers. It's not just conveying certain ideas and concepts about research, but also creating research as a social space. And a very important question that at least I'm interested in is the way that academics construct their subject positions. This is the kind of French terminology that I like to use to point out the social roles and places they have in academic research. And the point is that to play a certain role among researchers, you need to be recognized for your subject position. I mean, it's like identity. You need to establish a certain identity. If there's no identity that is socially recognized in the scientific community, it's very difficult to participate in research. You may be familiar with French discourse theory. There's a certain structuralist tendency in French discourse theory. I have a more praxeological idea of subject positions, that is, questions how they participate in positionings and positioning practices. So it's not only something, subject positions are not just names which are imposed on the researchers from outside, from the institution, for example, but it's something that they constantly negotiate and construct. So it's a back and forth between established institutional taxonomies, for example, or institutionally established borders, and what people do in their everyday lives. And a special role for occupying a subject position is played by social categorizations. So basically, every subject position that academic researchers can or cannot occupy is an ensemble of social categories. Various labels, descriptions, ideas about people that are more or less socially established in the community. And I've come up with a sort of heuristic table about possible categories that can play a role in academic research. And of course there are certain categories which are extremely important, which are necessary for any career. For example, you need to establish, I mean, it's not something intentional, it's something that just happens. I mean, I'm not saying that they have to, because I think they have to, because it's just happening, and the question is how we can account for it. So one type of categories that they need to secure in their careers is the institutional status. They need a certain place in the institution. Can be student, can be professor, but then there's some sort of category that needs to be attributed to researchers for them to play a role among other academics. And the other essential category is the discipline. And usually, I mean, you need to negotiate these different games in which these categories are established and attributed. So careers are, in a way, institutional careers. You move through institutions. Sometimes you move up. But they're never just institutional careers. They're always intricately intertwined with all these symbolic, fluffy, discursive dynamics, like in scientific communities where reputation is attributed to people. So it can be something very ordinary, something very everyday life. And it's not controlled by institutions. There are so many people participating in these dynamics, so that certain things happen that nobody ever plans. So sometimes certain new research areas just emerge like that, without anybody really understanding why. And this can make a huge difference for careers, of course, of academics. So finally, what we see is there are not only these probably academic categories which can define the social position of people in the social world of research, like status or discipline. There are all kinds of non-academic categories which are extremely important for researchers. And there's some categories, non-academic categories, which all researchers have, and everybody needs to be categorized according to these areas. And some, only some of them have, and they may or may not make a difference in academic careers. So here, for example, the non-academic categories that apply to all researchers, what I call here the everyday life categories. Of course, all the intersectional categories, from race, gender to citizenship, it makes a huge difference sometimes. Doesn't mean that people talk about it, but of course, as with any other categories, if you have the wrong category, it can be a big problem or it can be good for you. And there are also these informal categories. I mean, you know, that people, they have a certain hobby and they play music and all that, and some of that can make a difference too. So it's not that it's just about academic things. And I mean, people know that a certain president of the American Sociological Association is a jazz musician, and people will talk about it. And then there are all these non-academic categories which are applied to some researchers, and what we could see in the interviews is a quite important role of civil society involvement, like grassroots organizations, especially among sociologists. And so there are lots of people who are active in non-academic areas. And in some cases, of course, this too can make a huge difference for academic careers. So to account for the way that academic success is constructed over long times in these very large populations of academics, it is necessary to have a look at how these different categories play together and define the social subject position of people in the social space. And this is a very messy thing. Nobody controls anything on that, of course. But it's not arbitrary. There are very strong social forces working behind that. And it is a very exclusive game, which sometimes leads to quite enormous hierarchies. And that's what I call here discursive capitalism. I mean, as a product of all these discursive practices of people engaging in everyday practices and institutional practices and all kinds of different practices, some subject positions can gain enormous value, and many others are excluded. And this can be translated into very objective measures of value, like salaries. Sometimes it doesn't. But the point is that academic discourse is not just a practice that translates or reproduces inequalities, but it also constitutes inequalities by saying something about others, by giving attention, visibility to others in our very everyday gossiping, for example. We produce inequalities which are not just the reflection of some underlying social structure of classes, for example. Discourse really produces some hierarchies, inequalities that people in the end need to reckon with. So that's very quickly the theoretical background of my work. That's the stuff I'm thinking about now, and trying to put it all together. We mentioned the database, Webby, and so what we hope to do at some point is to see how the larger structures, social structures within the population of linguists and sociologists look like, especially the institutionally established structures between researchers in these three and a half countries. And I want to talk about two things now, to focus a little bit on something that is perhaps of interest to you. One thing, the question of how gender comes in, because of course this is one of the categorizations which are extremely important. I mean, it applies to everybody. And the other thing is how thinking about mobility and space, the way that people are situated in a discursive space, can help explain some of the dynamics and processes going on here. Let me start with a few results so they have an idea of what we're talking about. With Webby, we can visualize the careers of about 3,000 full professors. We collected all professors of I think last summer, right? It was last summer, right? Mm. So it's a snapshot of the CVs, basically, of all these professors in these disciplines. And so what we will be able to do in the next few months, I hope, to see biographical patterns, how certain people with certain categories, I mean, it's mostly institutional categories in Webby, of course, because we can't enter the kind of fluffy, informal stuff that easily. I mean, that's in the nature of the more discursive kind of categorizations, that they're not that objective, not that clear. But what we can do with Webby, with a kind of more qualified approach, is to account for the institutional categorizations of this population. And so what I can show here is that there is a certain distribution of female and male professors in these two disciplines. We have altogether something like, I think, 1,000 German full professors, 600 French, and about 300 British professors. Which, I mean, it's very difficult, of course, to make generalizations on the basis of these categorizations, which are always very specific. And of course, a UK professor is not exactly the same thing as a French professor and a German professor. So there's of course some sort of controversy over whether the status of a UK professor isn't rather the upper group echelon of German professors, the W3 professors in Germany, and things like that. Anyway, what we can see here is in every country there's a sizable number of female and male full professors in these disciplines, and we have a certain distribution among female and male professors. So we have more of a balance in linguistics than in sociology, and more of a balance in France and in the UK as compared to Germany. I mean, to sum it up very rapidly. Now, I've done, I think, about 120 interviews with academics in the last few years, and what I can tell you is my slightly, well, non-systematic impressions from what I've seen in these interviews in these different countries. It's nothing I can visualize in any systematic way at this point, but this is the stuff that I would expect to see in the next few years as we analyze the material more systematically. One thing that we definitely see, and I think that's a universal phenomenon, is the rise of women, not only in academia, but outside academia, in the professional world, and worldwide. We see it everywhere. And education plays a very important role here. Women have been extremely successful in succeeding in the educational world. And this is something that can be translated in certain generational experiences, which I can see sometimes quite drastically, especially in the US. I'm not sure about the UK, but what I saw in my interviews in the US is 3 types of collective experiences among women academics. Old women, that is 60 plus, close to retirement or something, they tell these horrible stories about male chauvinist pigs. And it's something which is really very, very present. And it's not just a few of them, it's a very kind of, it must have been a common experience in the 60s, even the 70s, to be kind of sometimes insulted or having to deal with very unpleasant experiences. Then we have the young women. On the level of assistant professors, for example, they never talk about it. Never, ever. Have I heard of any experience of an unpleasant discrimination of a young academic woman. And then you have the middle-aged women. And middle-aged women are around 35, 40, 45. Middle-aged women don't personally experience, the ones that I've seen, it's not systematic, it's some sort of hypotheses that we can play with. Middle-aged women share this experience of young women. They no longer really had to deal with these very unpleasant male colleagues. A lot of recruitment has taken place since the mid-80s. That was really very clear in the US. Within a few years, like 2 or 3 years, institutions decided it's a big problem to have male clubs and departments. So within a few years in the 80s, departments really opened up and recruited women on a large scale. And the middle-aged women are a product of that recruitment. And they're now in this kind of transition period between associate and full professor. So they all got tenure, of course. But then what they experience is the invisible structures of patriarchy or hierarchy or whatever you would like to call it. Because what's happening is there's no personal direct discrimination. And, but in the US you can see enormous salary differences between women and men at that level. Not on the assistant professor level, but when they're around 35 to 50, some can get outside job offers and some don't. And here you see extreme differences. I mean, some women are extremely successful with that, no question about that. But on the whole, you probably see many more women staying on the same level. I mean, in the US, they all become full professors because hierarchy is translated much more through salaries and not just status. But basically, the mark of success is higher salaries. And you have enormous spreads in the US. You have people staying on up to, I mean, in a good research institution like Michigan, staying with about $120,000, I mean, full professors, and others with $400,000. I mean, you have huge, huge spreads between people in departments and also between disciplines. Now, that's something that I would expect takes place to some degree in Europe as well. You see that there's a career track which has been very much open at some points, and now probably see little discrimination of women on the entry level, but continuing inequalities on the upper levels. And that's perhaps something which can be explained through, not through this kind of old style personal discrimination from old boys, whatever you call them, but this is really something where discursive capitalism comes in. Because to get job offers outside the institution is something that can reflect the presence in the academic space. And that presence is something that managers in departments can then turn into salaries or status. So, and it's very much depersonalized as a mechanism. And you see a lot of people reproducing the difference in presence, visibility in the community, and the decision makers, they don't think in terms of gender, of course, but they think in terms of competition between institutions. So they need to keep certain people and then give them a lot of money, for example. And they don't think in terms of gender, of course. There's no personal discrimination of women involved here. But the whole system, of course, is a very much inequality-driven or inequality-producing kind of system. Now, to understand this kind of continuing presence of these discursive capitalist mechanisms, I want to point out a few things that we need to keep in mind, because it's not that there's a given group of people who are all in the same car and compete with each other. But of course, I mean, we talk about extremely tiered academic job markets. In other words, not everybody competes with everybody, right? You see regional job markets for certain people, national job markets for certain people, and international job markets for certain people. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. And of course, for certain job markets, for example, the regional job market tends to be much more defined by teaching staff. Whereas research tends to be defined more by national job markets, which explains, I think, to some degree, why research has always been so important for the academic institution. It's just way more difficult for academic institutions to recruit researchers in a very big international competitive space researchers who are still, of course, extremely important to define the prestige of the institution. And so you see that these tiered kind of complex, these structured job markets, they can produce different types of value hierarchies. There are certain hierarchies which apply on a certain level, for example, the regional level. There are certain things that are more valued by people participating in that area. And this may not replicate the things that are valued on another level, for example, in more internationally organized spaces. It is something which is not organized around the same social rules and criteria. It's something very complex and contradictory for the people. So what I can also mention is that, of course, in different academic systems, there are quite different constraints working on careers. If you have a look at, for example, I mean, that's the classic, I mean, everybody talks about, oh, these poor Germans, and they never get a full position before the age of whatever. And, I mean, you have these bottlenecks in recruitment, which are quite different. You have recruitment systems, for example, in France, where basically you're expected to get a full permanent position, a fully tenured position within 4 years after the PhD. And there's no real market anymore, no real kind of established recruitment space for any other biographical point. So either you enter the system at that point or you're not in. Other systems, of course, have different temporal structures. In the US, it's not that different from France. In the US, it is very important, like here in the UK a bit, that you're part of a certain institutional tier. Of course, you have Ivy League institutions, and basically in Ivy League institutional job markets, you just see Ivy League students. It is not that open, finally. If you have a look at who's recruited, it is usually just students from these American Ivy League universities. And then you have middle tier or lower tier job markets where people apply for jobs in colleges, for example, or other universities which are not that prestigious and all that. So, and they would never have the idea of comparing these job markets. If you go to Boston University and Harvard, they live in different social worlds. They don't think that they compete. And now this is something, of course, which is highly gendered as well. What happens, and that has been shown for the academic job markets in the UK, where you have a similar kind of tiered structure between Oxbridge, the research universities, and the post-92 universities. What happens in the UK, for example, is that to get an academic job, it is very good to have a degree from Oxbridge. Depends on the disciplines of it. And then some people, they stay in that kind of top 10 institutional area, and others, they go down to the 92. It's very difficult to talk about that. Sorry for this kind of very objectifying sociological kind of rhetoric. The point is, there are certain things which can happen. That is, you can go down, but it's almost impossible to go up. If you come with a 92 degree, it's almost impossible to go to Cambridge afterwards. And what happens here is, of course, that many people who go down from Oxbridge or Russell Group, whatever, they have interruptions because of family events and things like that. So you see quite a few people from Oxbridge in 92 universities in more teaching-oriented jobs. Okay, so what I want to point out here is there is quite a structured complexity here. I mean, different spaces where people move, constraining what you can do over time, and we're talking about long times. It's not just about going and coming back within a day. It's about whole lifetimes. And what I want to think about to wrap it up is that people establish their discursive subject positions in a complex space where basically different specialities come together. They move in different social spaces. They move geographically. They move institutionally. And they move in an epistemic space. Here, for example, I mean, I call it geographical spaces, institutional spaces, and disciplinary spaces. And in different spaces and different levels of these spaces, very different rules and practices may apply. So it's not a homogeneous space which works according to one social rule, like the one criteria of academic excellence, but people always need to negotiate very different things. And I'm not saying that the regional level, for example, is lower than the international level. It's just a different game, because everybody is always anchored among very personal colleagues somewhere, and in an international space of academic disciplines, which are always structured around global references. So it's not that people are in one lower or another higher space, but they always need to negotiate and straddle these different social spaces. And within that complex social space, any identity can have a very ambivalent value. It's not that gender, for example, is something which is automatically a marker for high or low social status, or success, or something like that. Same thing for mobility. It's not automatically something positive for the whole system or negative. It depends on the situation in which these categories, in which these identities are enacted. And in order to account for the very ambivalent values that these identities can have in certain social spaces, it is necessary to account for how these people occupy a certain recognized subject position. This is basically which explains much better why certain things are valued. The question is, who gets recognition as being somebody in the world of research, as a more or less recognizable, visible academic? And this question cannot be reduced to some existing set of categories, like it's necessary to be a male or female researcher, it's necessary to be mobile, immobile. The question is much more with whatever categories that come together, that you mobilize over your career to define your subject position. Does it add up and give you some sort of recognition in whatever space? And that's why gender is sometimes positive. I mean, a certain gender identity is sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It's always all at the same time. And if I think, for example, of the question of mobility, for some people, in academia, mobility is something, international mobility is something a bit weird. For some other people, it's something very important. And in a certain way, it's all at the same time. I mean, what I experience, for example, is there's this constant picking on me being mobile, especially since Brexit. And at the same time, this doesn't mean that this is not really appreciated. So things like that need to be seen as something that are not positive or negative in itself. But the question is, does it really come together, and does it allow people, certain people, to establish themselves in this academic discourse of research? Now, these things are, of course, not only social. We're not talking just about institutional mobilities across different universities or with respect to certain tasks. Not just talking about geographical human beings, traveling around, but it's also a very discursive thing. In academic discourse, in very different in the very different discursive practices that academics engage in, from publications to everyday talk, people constantly negotiate their position in discourse spaces. And if I had a bit more time, we could talk about how they construct these discourse spaces. And of course, it is inevitable to construct these discourse spaces through talk, because whenever we talk, we refer to our position in a space with respect to space, time, modality. That's Paul's work, for example, which refers to enunciative pragmatics, which is a strand of pragmatism in France. And through their everyday discourses, people basically they constantly negotiate the different spaces that in which they move, and they can legitimate their positions in certain spaces. So the question is not only how they move socially, but also how this is enacted, constructed, also undermined in the very discursive kind of practices that they always pursue. And so what I would suggest, if we had the time, is to have a look at some of these extracts of interviews, perhaps other material. We discussed some publications in these interviews where we see that different specialities are constructed, which make sense of the people speaking here as subjects in a broader discursive space. And of course, these spaces, they're not just ephemeral, they're not just something here and now in this interview situation, but they're to some degree established in the categories that can institutionalize a certain way of living in a social space. They can also, of course, establish certain ways of positioning people in these spaces as being positive or negative. So we see very different discourse spaces opening up about what they talk and what they write about. That's basically what I wanted to talk about today. It is really supposed to open up a discussion and to get something going, which of course will take much more time. Thanks.
I was wondering about this concept of, you said academic capitalism, or yeah. So maybe you can say something more about this, because I wasn't sure how to imagine academic capitalism, how we can accumulate, and who is the owner of the means of production, if you think in Marx terms. Maybe you can explain this a bit more.
Yeah. Well, basically the idea is that there are many people in the academic space, in the academic world, who participate in academic discourse, which is very broadly all kinds of activities which are vaguely related to language. And what happens is that while there are so many people using language to position themselves and others, there are not that many people whose position is ratified and institutionalized. And so in a way, value is something that is very much tied to the question of who is recognized as a subject in the space. This is something which everybody basically participates in. Value is constructed, value of subject positions is constructed by anybody using language, whether she or he wants it or not. But the recognized subject positions are monopolized in a way by few people. And in Webby, we have basically the discursive capitalists of those whose symbolic value in the community has been turned into an institutional position in universities. And this is, of course, a mechanism which is quite crucial for any career in academic research. And this is not about something that they control or plan or intend. Everybody, of course, who enters this game wants to be recognized as a researcher, I guess, or do some research and be seen for it. But it doesn't reflect what people do. It's very important to account for the resources that different people have in different institutions. I mean, we can look into, for example, the tiered structures between institutions. Some countries, they don't participate in the global space of research, for example, because it is very much biased and very much unequal. And this is something that we do. It's not that anybody decided to do it, but anybody participating in these discursive practices in academic research reproduces and stabilizes the system in a way.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation, Johannes. I was wondering, when you mentioned the tiered academic job market, your research is mainly concerned about international mobility rather than international academic job market as being tiered mobility, and also whether you have considered the tiered academic job markets can be differentiated by academic disciplines. So I can think of some black swans when we look at the academic biographies, how their academic career development and mobility are interrelated in different national and international contexts. And in the field of education, for instance, I can think of many black swans which do not fit in your tiered academic job markets categorization. So would you explain whether you are just looking at the national context as a tiered academic job markets or international mobility as well?
Yeah. I mean, that's really a very important point, and I would think that I'd need to add the institutional position, for example, here as an ambivalent kind of ambivalent value as well. It is not necessarily kind of a bad thing to be in a low-tier institution. It depends on how this all adds up together over time. And it can be a very good thing to be at the periphery. Certain things are much easier to do if you don't have too many people around, if it's not that kind of visible for a certain period of time, things like that. So I would definitely say that you can't say there's a direct reflection or a direct consequence of the institutional kind of pecking order into academic success or discursive presence. The other question, I'm not sure I totally understood, but I think what I need to mention here is, I mean, academic research is, on the whole, a pretty national thing. I mean, if you have these different social geographical spaces of regional, national, and international, most academic systems are of the countries that we studied, which is very different from other countries like Argentina or China, whatever. These countries with very strong developed academic systems, they not only produce their own staff, but they also recruit them. So there's not that much pressure to recruit from outside, and there's not that much pressure for people to go outside. However, the UK is a bit different. The UK massively recruits from outside, but again, have a look at where they recruit, especially in the field of research. Almost never for administration. Senior administrators in the UK are almost all British white.
Oh, no, I don't think so. Because I have come across some European colleagues who are in the administration position in UK universities.
Yeah,
so you cannot really generalize. And also Chinese, Chinese colleague working in the administration in another UK university. So again,
yeah.
how much can we generalize?
But I'm pretty sure that if you compare the proportion of internationals in research and in administration, you would find many more internationals in research than in administration.
Yeah, that's true, yes.
And that's something almost universal. You see a higher level of international recruitment in CNRS in France than in the university. On a much, much lower level on the whole than in the UK. But you see that it's easier for these institutions to recruit internationals for the research than for administration. And I think that's something that reminds us of the importance of non-scientific practices. I mean, dealing with institutional power questions, for example, distribution of resources, decision making, and this is something which is a very different game. It's very important, and people can have a visibility through that. So it's not something that is in any way secondary, but it's a different game, and different people deal with these things in different ways. So the importance of administration, I think, may explain why, on the whole, academic systems are still quite national, because you don't really have international institutions. They're usually part of a national system of bureaucratic rules, and job markets in academia are rather national, with big differences between countries. The US is very open at certain levels, but before the PhD, very open for PhDs, but then very much closed for the recruitment for assistant professors. I don't think it's much more open than other systems in Europe for non-American PhDs. And so yeah, is that something that responds to your question?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but the disciplinary based differentiation in what you say, the tiered academic job markets may need to be further articulated. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time with my own question.
Thank you very much. Really interesting project, definitely. I wanted to just go back to your generational difference in the experience of women academics, and I was thinking as you were speaking that yes, there's sort of very obvious generational difference in the circumstances that that these academics are living in. But I was also thinking that I think we see generational perceptions of discrimination, and I think that in part sort of corresponds with some of the waves of feminism and the ways that the different waves of feminism have sort of infiltrated into popular culture. And I think there's definitely a kind of generation there which possibly corresponds with your assistant professors who were taught that that discrimination was over, and were taught that everyone's equal and that everything is by meritocracy, and who have almost been sort of blinded to potential sort of perpetuation of some of these inequalities. So I think, you know, yeah, it's undeniable that things have got a lot better, but I also think that, you know, a hell of a lot of studies are starting to be done now. There's kind of new, I suppose, almost feminist movement to identify continued sexual harassment on university campuses, which are sort of and continued outcry about the pay gap. Warwick has various academic task forces trying to combat this. Athena Swan, etc., etc. So I'm sort of thinking, well, yes, we need to look at the structures and the circumstances, but I think also that generational perception is really important in these questions.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for this remark, because I'm not sure that the difference of generational perceptions reflects a difference in objective social structures, because to some degree, of course, people may not have the experience of gendered discrimination, gender-based discrimination before they come into academia, and they may take a few years to see it. That's, I think, what's happened to these middle-aged women, and it might just as well happen to these young women now. That you will have the same interviews in 10 years, and they would come up with the same tendency of pointing out the kind of hidden structures of patriarchy. But I think it's probably both. There's a real change, but then there are these kind of patterns where people just move through and then realize that they're still there. So, I mean, gender was not something I was looking for. It was very open interviews, so I could just register whatever they came up with. And I would guess that the kind of a certain type of discrimination that was still a bit more prevalent until the mid-80s, that some of that has disappeared in almost any country, with various degrees. It'd be necessary to talk about France a bit more in detail here, but I think we don't have the time here, and I think that some of these things are pretty universal. And it's, again, I think there's some ambivalence here. It is not that gender really explains the inequality, but there are all these everyday practices which participate in constructing inequalities, which then make gender important or not. And that's why I like to focus on these general inequality-producing mechanisms of discursive capitalism, and see how gender and other things are tied to that. And yeah.
I think we'll probably have to finish here, I'm sorry, because we're running out of time. I'm not sure if the room's booked afterwards. But thank you very much for Johannes, and I'm sure he'd be happy to have some more questions afterwards, or maybe via email. So thank you very much. And please do take a sandwich before you leave. There's still